In many ways, gaming in 2024 felt like a year of extremes. In the AAA space, barely a month went by when there wasn't a major disappointment or even a major flop of some kind, while in contrast, indie and AA games continue to go from strength to strength. Last year I played 37 new games released during 2024 on the channel, the vast majority of them so-called smaller titles, and in compiling this list I genuinely struggled to whittle them down to just a top 10. At least a couple of them created gaming memories that have stayed with me, and will likely do so for a long time to come. Before diving into my top 10 games, I'll just add my usual disclaimer that my list only includes games that I've actually played on the channel, and only those that fully released during the year, which means no demos or early access titles. Oh, and for those interested in such things, in the description below this video you'll find links to my series on each of the games featured, as well as to their Steam store page. So without further ado, let me tell you about my favourite games of 2024. It feels a little disingenuous to begin this entry by talking about a completely different developer, but in this case I think it makes sense. For much of the past decade, Me games were synonymous with a genre they single-handedly revived that many, including myself, thought extinct, that of real-time, squad-based stealth tactics, as seen in beloved titles like Commandos and Desperados, a series they themselves would continue in 2020 with Desperados 3. Sadly, after releasing their third and arguably best such title, Shadow Gambit, in 2023, the studio closed its doors. At which point enter Artificer, the developer also responsible for one of my top games of 2023, Showgunners, a turn-based XCOM-like. With Sumerian 6, however, the Warsaw-based developer picked up the stealth tactics torch and ran with it brilliantly. Combining the same formula Me had reintroduced so successfully, added a few tweaks of their own and delivered an engaging story of an occult-infused alt-history World War II. In it, you lead a team of allied agents with unique, often supernatural powers across a series of massive, varied maps, from Gothic chateaux to open airfields to ancient tropical ruins, sneakily taking down scores of Nazis in an attempt to prevent the Third Reich from getting its hands on another worldly power and save the world. Just as Showgunners did before it, I feel this is a game that flew a bit under the radar, and my hope is that if Artificer continues to deliver such outstanding tactics games, they eventually gain the wider recognition they, in my opinion at least, deserve. What if The Thing? But instead of being trapped in a remote Antarctic base, you're trapped on a remote North Sea oil rig. It's a simple premise, but an effective one, and it's a credit to Still Wakes the Deep that it near perfectly captures the same existential dread and cosmic horror of trying to survive a deadly, unknowable enemy in a hostile environment, all while trying to work out what the heck is happening, as John Carpenter's classic film. Even down to the bleak ending. You take on the role of Cameron Kaz McCleary, who takes a job as an electrician on said oil rig in order to escape his past, which catches up to him first in reality and then in a sequence of increasingly heartbreaking flashbacks. When the platform's drill digs too deep, it inadvertently unleashes a wholly alien force that is soon tearing the entire structure to pieces, while transforming many of its inhabitants into grotesque, mutated horrors. Apologies for once again harking back to The Thing, but in my opinion, where Still Wakes the Deep excels is in its similar understanding that while misshapen monsters and gore provide visceral thrills, true horror can be found in quieter moments when our paranoia about what we might encounter in the darkest corners, the fear of what we can hear but not yet see, makes the hairs on your neck stand on end. The horror of the situation is also enhanced by the slowly dawning revelation that these terrible monstrosities you encounter retain some basic human understanding, some awareness of the people they once were. The section where you're pursued by your hateful former boss is elevated by his screamed, unflattering opinions of Kaz. All in all, not just one of the best horror games of 2024, but one of the best games overall.
A madness for spiritualism and the search for the great beyond has been unleashed in the London of our days.
As regular viewers will already know, I do love a good point-and-click adventure, and Postmodern Adventure's second title, their follow-up to 2022's Nightmare Frames, is a very good one. Where their previous game leaned heavily into the feel and tone of 1980s slasher films, An English Haunting puts us in a very different place and time, that being Victorian England. Their efforts to evoke the atmosphere of the period is no less impressive, however. We play as University Professor Patrick Moore, who, due to the disappearance and apparent theft committed by his colleague, is tasked with proving the existence of ghosts and the afterlife in just a few short days. While there are occasional jump scares, for the most part An English Haunting is content to let its horror be a slow burn, present in the inherently creepy practices of the time, including spiritualism and death photography. However, the last section of the game kicks everything up several notches, fully embracing its Lovecraftian undercurrent of cosmic horror. Any title in the genre lives or dies by its puzzles, and in that regard An English Haunting can stand proud. While nothing is handed to you on a plate, there is a logic to almost everything, without having to resort to the try everything on everything else trope. The story and characters are also engaging. I can't immediately think of any other game that lets us play as Sherlock Holmes creator Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and it's definitely one that I'd recommend to fans of the genre.
The dragon stirs in the void, and an empire trembles. The rule of the Magi Lords is failing. Where now shall we place our faith?
I'm not entirely sure what it says about me, that this is the fourth straight game on this list that's heavily influenced by Lovecraftian cosmic horror. Probably nothing good. But rather than dwell on the ramifications of that, I'll move swiftly on and instead enthuse about Scold Against the Black Priory, an incredible love letter to the late 80s, early 90s RPGs such as Ultimas 1 through 4. Where its true genius lies, though, is that beyond the nostalgic aesthetics lie modern sensibilities and accessibility. Essentially, it plays like you remember those classic games of old playing. In not trying to faithfully recreate every aspect of the genre it mimics, it avoids the outdated and baffling clunkiness that greet anyone trying those 35-year-old games today. It's also much better paced. Where my memories of playing Ultima 4 on my old Amiga mostly revolve around wandering aimlessly and only ever occasionally touching upon the story, the plot of Scold progresses breezily, and while in a few cases you're given a choice of how to proceed, you always have an objective clearly in mind. And that story is genuinely interesting, featuring all the favourite Lovecraftian themes of madness, unknowable evil from beyond the stars, and tentacled terrors of the deep. I'd be lying if I said I fully understand everything come the end, but I enjoyed the ride nonetheless. Considering its predecessor featured on my list of top 10 games of 2022, it's perhaps not a surprise to see the second game in the Golden Idol series here as well. That's not to suggest, however, that this is simply a case of more of the same. Rise is very much an evolution of the formula. While at its core it's still about unravelling the mysteries of a semi-static scene of murder and/or mayhem to deduce who did what to whom, the little tweaks that have been made enhance the experience further. Some tweaks may be slightly divisive. I've seen negative reactions to the new look art style, but for me the presentation has improved, while other changes, such as streamlining the way players discover the various clue words required to identify a solution, have refined the process. Others are inarguable improvements, such as grouping sets of scenarios together with an overarching mystery linking them, and the need to recall people and events, or even minor background details easily missed from earlier chapters, which all then contribute to the final denouement. Among the grisly deaths, sinister conspiracy and tale of greed and ambition, there are even dashes of humour. A good time all round. After all the death, destruction and cosmic horror in the list so far, it's time for a change of pace, like a relaxing hike through a charming alpine fantasy land. For a game that ultimately boils down to whacking a succession of monsters from Germanic folklore with swords, A feeling of wholesomeness pervades Dungeons of Hinterberg, whether you're exploring the mountains and forests, making new friends, or traversing a pleasingly diverse set of dungeons. Perhaps it stems from the premise that one day a bunch of dungeon portals opened up in a picturesque mountain town, and, rather than represent a world-threatening danger, a new tourist industry formed around them. Running around a dungeon, killing the inhabitants, who, to be fair, seem fairly content with this arrangement, is something you do between breakfast and a revitalizing hot chocolate at the hotel bar that evening. While the stakes appear, initially at least, fairly low, the story is just as much about your character's self-discovery, having reached that hinterland between an increasingly distant youth, an unsatisfying career, and a nebulous future of adult responsibility. That alone wouldn't have been enough for an inclusion in this list, but I found the gameplay loop immensely satisfying. Each of the game's 20-something dungeons is distinct, not only in aesthetic, but also in the nature of challenge, whether it's a jumping puzzle, environmental puzzle, snowboard slalom, boss fight, or any combination of the above. I always look forward to seeing what the next would bring. The combat too is fun, simple enough to grasp, but with enough nuance and differing skills and abilities to make it rewarding to master and experiment with different combinations. Tying socializing with the various town inhabitants and fellow travelers with some meta-progression was also a nice touch. I enjoyed my time in Hinterberg just as much as the main character did.
In a world where the top special forces operatives are all just wizards for some reason, one team is unstoppable.
As soon as I saw the premise for Tactical Breach Wizards, two thoughts crossed my mind. The first was, I have to play this, and the second was, why has no one thought of this before? The idea that a group of wizards, witches, and other magic users applying their powers as a tactical SWAT team is an inspired one, as was the decision to make it into an Into the Breach style, chess-like puzzle game. But where Into the Breach was about stripped back, streamlined design, it's not long here before you're presented with a dizzying array of options. But thanks to a freely available time rewind ability, neatly explained in-universe, it never becomes overwhelming. Indeed, the game actively encourages you to experiment and let your crazy ideas play out in the knowledge you can reset things if they don't work out. Each level becomes an enticing puzzle box that calls out to be poked and prodded until its workings are revealed. That feeling of being handed an overflowing toy box and told to just have fun persists, from challenging bonus objectives that solely earn new character skins without impacting gameplay, meaning that it's entirely up to players whether they pursue them or not, to the rich vein of Tom Francis's signature, and wonderfully British, humour that runs throughout. If I have one minor criticism, it would be that, even with the helpful time rewind, the sheer volume of abilities and variables available to both allies and enemies in the endgame did start to make my brain ache a little bit. But overall, Tactical Breach Wizards remains, in my opinion at least, the best pure tactical title of 2024.
It's my desire that the Underworld estate be passed over in its entirety to...
There was a time, not so long ago, sometime shortly after the LucasArts golden era of the 90s, where the point-and-click adventure game genre was declared dead. Now, I'm no gaming historian, so I can't pinpoint exactly where and when the revival began, but it's clear, to me at least, that the last few years have seen a triumphant return to form for the genre. I've already included one such example on this list, but while I'd been eagerly awaiting the release of an English Haunting for some time, Locomotive came out of nowhere and hit me like a deliciously ironic runaway train. If I had to sum it up in a single word, it would be assured. The quality of the writing, humour and puzzles remain high from start to finish. The larger-than-life characters are all great fun, with a certain Herman Merman, the highlight, and the pixel art and animations thereof are surely among the best in class. It's absolutely astonishing that this is Developer Robust's game's debut title. In a great couple of years for point-and-click adventures, Locomotive stands tall, and the best compliment I can pay it is that playing it put me in mind of a bunch of 30-year-old games. The peak of LucasArts' heyday, in other words.
Hail Trova as paradise,
a realm of hope and promise. But one must not be ensnared by this illusion.
We go from a tribute act of the 90s to one of the early noughties. With the release of Gothic in 2001, German developer Piranha Bytes created a subgenre of RPGs that would remain uniquely their own across different game series, with Risen and Elix. This typically saw you thrust into the role of a stranger in an unfamiliar, hostile land who would have to tentatively progress from wearing rags and wielding sticks against a succession of murderous creatures and enemies who would happily beat you to a pulp if you make one wrong move. Running away is a useful, even vital tactic early on. You simply weren't a chosen one, initially at least, but some poor sap just trying to survive. Other elements include free exploration, warring factions you can choose to align with, novel combat systems, and lashings of good-natured jank. Oh, and mining. Lots of mining. At which point, enter Drover, a top-down 2D homage to Piranha Bytes' back catalogue, and the early Gothic games in particular. Just as in those games, the main appeal lies in exploring this mysterious world, gradually learning its rules and threats, carefully pushing into new areas, waiting to see if it's somewhere that you're able to deal with or will need to run away from to return later. The slow grind of improving both your gear and your own combat skill to overcome increasingly deadly threats. The unbeatable pleasure of trouncing an enemy that only a few hours previously was wiping you out in a couple of hits. There's also mining. A lot of mining. Drover is a retro must-play for any Gothic fans. Most of the time, in compiling these annual lists, I try to apply a healthy measure of objectivity to my selections. In this case, however, I make no bones about being subjective. Our Adventurer Guild is, simply, the most fun I had playing a game on the channel in 2024, and a massive factor in why is the involvement of the wonderful community. From creating their own characters, to reacting to in-game events, to cheering on others. It was as close to an interactive experience as I've had since starting the channel nearly 3 years ago, and it was, truly, a joy. But that's to take nothing away from the game itself. Indeed, it's to its credit that it has a flexible character creation system that introduces flaws as well as strengths to each member of your guild, which, independent of your input, creates tensions, alliances, even fistfights and romantic entanglements. It imbues your guild with a sense of life and personality that you don't get from other games in the XCOM-like genre, where fighters are mostly treated more as inert game pieces than living, breathing individuals with their own hang-ups and behaviours. There's also the central conceit of managing a guild of fantasy heroes, taking on quests, levelling up their abilities, improving their gear, crafting, base building, going out into the field for turn-based exploration and combat. It's basically at the centre of a Venn diagram of my favourite things in gaming, as if the developer reached into my brain and created it just for me. There's even the ability to establish separate squads of fighters with their own battle standards and team bonuses, injecting even more personality into proceedings. Even the weakest element, the somewhat simple aesthetic, has a personality of its own. It's not a perfect game, but despite some flaws, our Adventurer Guild is the game that gave me the most enjoyment this year, and created some of my best gaming memories on this channel. And at the end of the day, is that not what this pastime of ours is all about?